The townsfolk had already turned away when he said it. "I call her wife," Amos Carver muttered, loud enough to cut through the courthouse steps' mutterings. "And I don't take it back." Everything stopped. Even the flies seemed to still midair. Dust hung like smoke in the late summer heat. That girl. Shivering, bruised, skin like ashen, eyes swollen from what she'd endured, didn't say a word, but her fingers tightened around the edge of Amos's coat. It was the same coat he'd wrapped around her when he found her near dead in the canyon 3 weeks earlier. "Let's go back." The wind over Bitter Ridge had teeth that morning. Amos Carver nudged his mule, Josie, forward through the narrow pass, his eyes squinting against the dry gusts kicking dust across the ledge. He wasn't heading anywhere important, just scouting cedarwood for his stove, maybe checking traps if the bears hadn't sniffed them first. Life since the war had taught him to keep moving, even when you had nowhere left to be. The ridge opened wide where the cliffs dipped into sandstone bowls. That's where he spotted the blood trail. Not fresh, but not old either. Rust-dark streaks across the stones, leading down toward the canyon bed. His mule didn't like it, ears twitching, snorting. But Amos had seen too much in his life to turn from a trail like that. The buzzards circled low. He followed them, boots crunching over shale, hand resting easy on the rifle slung across his back. He found her beside the creek. A girl, no older than 20, maybe younger, lying face down beside a rock, one arm awkward beneath her like it had given out mid-crawl. Her hair was matted with dirt, and her dress torn at the seams. Her feet were bare, skin raw from walking God knows how far. There was a loop of iron shackled to her ankle. Amos didn't speak at first, just crouched beside her and touched 2 fingers to her neck. Alive, barely. He took off his coat and laid it over her back. Then he gathered her up in both arms like she weighed no more than a child, and carried her to his mule. For the next 5 days, Amos fed her broth and river water from a tin cup. He didn't ask questions. Not yet. Didn't press her to speak. Her throat was still torn up from thirst, and her body flinched every time his shadow crossed the room. His cabin sat 3 miles from town, tucked in the pine scrub where the road turned to rock. He hadn't hosted another soul in nearly 7 years. The place was quiet, almost too quiet for someone who'd been hurt. But she didn't run. She slept, curled like a leaf, and woke only to sip broth or glance toward the door when the wind knocked the shutters. One night, he caught her whispering something in her sleep. A name, maybe. Could have been Emma. Could have been help. He never asked again. On the 7th morning, she finally sat up and looked at him. "You can call me Clara," she said, voice hoarse. "That was my mother's name. I don't want mine no more." Amos just nodded once, poured more water into the tin cup, and handed it to her with a silence that meant, "You don't owe me anything." Trouble came on the 10th day. Sheriff Henley rode up with 2 deputies and dust in his teeth. His horse stomped outside the cabin while the men waited for Amos to come out. "Carver," Henley said, tilting his hat back. "Town's been talkin'. Heard you brought home something foul." Amos stood in the doorway. "She's not foul. She was shackled. Found on canyon land. That usually means escaped property. Or worse." Henley's eyes shifted over Amos's shoulder, toward the dim light inside. "She was left to die," Amos said flatly. "That usually means someone oughta hang for it." One of the deputies, young boy named Reed, spat into the dust. "That girl's cursed. Been passed from camp to camp. Heard she's got sickness in her blood. Some say she's—" Amos stepped off the porch. Reed shut up. "She ain't going back with you," Amos said. "And if anyone wants her, they'll have to go through me." Henley's jaw twitched. "We ain't here to fight you, Amos. Just bring you to town. Judge wants to know why you're harboring a girl the railroad marked as tainted." That word hung in the air. Tainted. It wasn't the first time Amos had heard it. Not in a town like theirs. They used it when they didn't want to say raped or ruined or used and left behind like a mule with a busted leg. The girl had stirred behind him. He could feel her breath near his back. He turned halfway, didn't look at her, just said, "Get your shoes on, Clara. I reckon it's time to face them." The courthouse was quieter than it should have been. People lined the steps. Men crossed their arms and muttered behind their beards. Women clutched shawls like they could ward off impurity with cotton and stitching. Inside, Judge Latimer looked down at them like they were a nuisance. "Mr. Carver," he said, "do you understand what this looks like?" "I understand what it is," Amos answered. "She was left to die. I didn't let her. And now you claim she lives under your roof, eats your food," Amos nodded, "and sleeps under your protection." Again, a nod. Murmurs rippled across the room. The word unclean was spoken, though not by name. Somewhere near the back, someone muttered, "She'll bring pestilence." Amos felt Clara press close behind him. Then he said it. "I call her wife." Silence. "She lives with me," he added. "I protect her, feed her, sit with her through the nights she can't breathe from what they did to her. That enough for a marriage?" Latimer's eyes narrowed. "You know she was passed around a railroad crew. Could be carrying. She's carrying bruises that ain't hers," Amos said, voice low. "That's all." The judge didn't respond right away. Nobody did. Then Amos turned, gently took Clara's wrist, and raised it. Not like a prize, but like a vow. She didn't flinch. "I don't need no church, no preacher, and no paper to make her my wife. All I need is her saying yes." She looked at him, really looked, and nodded once. Outside, the murmurs turned to outrage. But Amos Carver didn't let go of her hand. He never would. By morning, half the town had picked sides. Some said Amos Carver had lost his mind. A mountain man too long away from decent folk, now tangled up in something shameful. Others didn't say much at all, just kept their eyes down when he walked Clara into the general store, her hands shaking as she picked out flour and lye soap like any other wife. But there were some, the old women who'd seen too much, the war widows, the farmhands with sisters, who didn't speak out loud, but met Clara's gaze and gave the smallest of nods. Still, the whispers got louder. She was passed around by men building the Santa Fe line. They say she begged for food and offered herself to get it. Men don't call women like that wife. They call them ruined. Amos had heard worse. He carried a scar through his ribcage from a mini ball and another behind his knee from a Sioux lance. But this was different. This was the kind of wound that festered in the open air, the kind townsfolk could see, judge, and turn into something rotten. Clara never said much. She helped with the mules, cleaned what she could, and kept to the back corner of the cabin at night. Amos never crossed a line, never touched her, never tried to claim anything more than what she gave. Sometimes, when he came in from checking the traps, he'd find bread warming on the hearth and his rifle wiped clean. But the line between mercy and outrage was thinner than dust in a drought. And that line snapped the night the boy threw the stone. They'd gone to church that Sunday. Amos didn't care for sermons. Too much noise, too little truth. But Clara had whispered, "Can we?" And that was enough. They sat in the back pew, her gloved hands folded tight. The preacher didn't look their way, and neither did most of the town. The hymns rose and fell like wind through grass. But outside, just as they reached the mule, a boy not older than 15 flung a rock that caught Clara square in the shoulder. She gasped and stumbled, and Amos was beside her in a heartbeat. The boy, red hair, freckles, and a smirk born of cowardice, already had another stone in hand. "My pa says she's diseased," the boy shouted. "Says you'll both rot." Amos didn't raise a hand. He didn't draw his revolver. He just walked over, slow and sure, took the stone from the boy's hand, and looked him in the eyes. "Tell your pa he's welcome to say that to me," Amos said, face to face. The boy blinked, faltered, then turned and bolted toward the edge of town. A few folks on the street stared, some with disapproval, others with fear. Clara's hand gripped the edge of the wagon all the way home. That night, she stood at the threshold of Amos's bedroom, candlelight flickering across her face. "Why'd you say it?" she asked. "In court, that word. Wife." Amos didn't answer right away. He sat on the edge of the bed, rolling a tin cup between his palms like it held something more than water. Because that's what I meant, he said finally. Not what folks think it means. What it should. Clara stepped into the room. Her eyes weren't wet, but her voice trembled. You know what they did to me? What they all say. He nodded once. Do you believe it? I believe you survived, he said. And that's all I care about. She stood there a long time. Then, slowly, she sat beside him on the bed. Not close, but not afraid either. That was the moment the mule screamed. Amos was on his feet in a breath. He grabbed the Winchester from the wall and stepped out into the dark. Moonlight spilled silver across the clearing. 3 men stood at the edge of his land. 2 with rifles, 1 with a lantern. Carver, one shouted. We come peaceful. Just want a word. Amos didn't lower his rifle. Midnight's a strange hour for peace. Stranger still to shack up with a girl the railroad tossed out like garbage, another said. The lantern lifted. It was Judge Latimer. Amos, he said, voice flat. You've stirred up something bigger than this town can hold. There's talk of a meeting. Talk of driving you out. Amos looked past him toward the hills. Them railroad men, they coming too? Latimer hesitated. They heard she's here, and they don't want her telling tales. She hasn't said a word, Amos growled. They don't care. The wind picked up. Josie stomped and snorted behind the fence. What happens if I say no? Amos asked. You've made your stand, Carver, the judge said. But if the town votes, and they come with torches, they better bring more than torches. Latimer didn't answer. He just turned and walked away, the lantern bobbing like a ghost through the pines. When Amos turned back to the house, Clara stood on the porch. You heard. She nodded. Her arms were crossed, but her shoulders trembled. They're going to make me leave. Amos shook his head. No, she swallowed. They'll come for you too. He stepped up beside her, the rifle still warm in his hand. They'll come, he said, but not before morning, and not before we decide who we are. She looked at him, not with fear this time, but with something deeper, something like faith. And then, just as dawn began to break behind the pines, the first war drum echoed in the distance. But it wasn't coming from white men. It was coming from the east, from the ridge, and Amos recognized the sound. Comanche, God help them all. The drumbeats came slow at first, one every few heartbeats, like the land itself had started breathing. Amos stood at the edge of the porch, rifle resting against his hip, as the sound rolled in from the ridgeline like distant thunder. Clara stood behind him, her hands clasped around a shawl she hadn't noticed was slipping from her shoulders. They wouldn't, she said quietly. They wouldn't bring the Comanche into this. They didn't, Amos replied, eyes fixed on the treetops swaying in the low light. That sound ain't meant for the town. Clara moved to stand beside him. Her lips parted. Then who? Amos didn't answer, because deep down he already knew. There were things Clara hadn't said, things he hadn't asked, and in those long silences, he'd let her keep them, not out of fear, but out of respect. But now, as the pale sky bled into orange, and the earth trembled beneath the hooves of something large and organized, Amos realized what kind of shadow she'd truly been living under. She knows them, he murmured to himself, or they know her. By mid-morning, the town was a hive of motion. Riders galloped down from the south with reports. Someone had seen 5 scouts on the ridge. Someone else swore there was a fire circle near Widow's Bluff. Sheriff Henley tried to calm folks down, but you can't reason with old wives' tales and fresh fear. The town blacksmith nailed planks across his windows. The preacher refused to open the chapel doors, even for prayer. By noon, a boy burst through town with a cry. Tainted riders! Over the rise! Amos didn't saddle his mule. He simply slung the rifle across his back and walked. Clara tried to follow, but he stopped her with a glance. Stay, he said. Let me go first. She shook her head. If it's about me, I don't get to stay behind. He looked at her, long and hard, then nodded once. Together they walked through the pines, past the edge of the Carver land, and up to the trail that cut toward Broken Skull Pass. The dust there was still settling. Hoofprints crisscrossed the earth, not wild but organized. At the top of the ridge, just beyond the scrub trees, they saw the first rider. He was young, but carried himself like a warrior. His chest was bare but painted. A necklace of bear claws hung low, and his face bore the red-black streaks of mourning. Behind him, more riders emerged. 10, maybe 12, silent and mounted. They did not raise weapons. They waited. The young rider's eyes settled on Clara. Then he dismounted. Amos stepped forward, placing himself in front of her. "I ain't here to fight," he called. "But if you're here to drag her back, you better speak clear and fast." The young warrior looked at Amos, then past him, then back. He raised his chin. "She is called Fire at Dusk among us." Clara's breath hitched. The warrior continued. "She was taken by white men building your rail. She disappeared. We buried her name, thinking her dead." Now Clara stepped forward, her hand brushing Amos's sleeve as if to say it's all right. The warrior saw her, and for the first time his voice cracked slightly. "I am Toka. My mother was her mother's sister. She is kin. And we have come not for war." His eyes searched Clara's face. "But to bring her home if she chooses." Silence. Even the wind fell still. Clara stared at Toka a long time. Then she looked at Amos. His weathered face, his steady stance. The way he didn't try to stop her, only waited for her choice like a man who had already given his heart away, no matter the outcome. Finally, she turned to Toka and stepped forward. She didn't speak. She simply placed a hand over her chest, then raised her palm skyward. An old Comanche gesture Amos had seen only once before, when a grieving father had given up a daughter to marriage and knew he'd never see her again. Toka nodded. The others turned their horses. But Clara didn't follow. "I'm not going back," she said. "Not yet." Toka's brow furrowed. "You live with him?" "I do. After what was done, you are still willing to stay among his people." Clara looked out over the valley below. The chapel steeple caught the sun in the distance. The mountains cast long shadows across the flatlands. Somewhere a raven called once. "I'm not staying for his people," she said softly. "I'm staying for him." Toka looked at Amos again, measured him. Then, without another word, he stepped back onto his horse, gave a short whistle, and the Comanche riders turned as one. No war cry, no arrows, just the thunder of hooves disappearing back into the hills. Amos exhaled, long and low. Clara's hand found his. "They won't understand," she whispered. "They don't have to," Amos said. "Only we do." Back in town, the fear hadn't gone. But when folks asked about the riders, Amos just said, "They came to ask, not to take." No one dared push harder. But that night, someone left a sign nailed Carver Gate, a crude drawing of a woman hanging from a tree, with the word, Tainted, scrawled beneath in red paint. Amos burned it without a word. And that night, for the first time, Clara didn't sleep in the corner. She lay beside him, eyes open, still breathing shallow, but close enough that their shoulders touched. Not from fear, from choice. And that made all the difference. Rain fell the next morning, soft, steady, and rare for August. It soaked the dirt roads, dampened the anger in the wind, and turned the pine needles slick beneath Amos Carver's boots. Inside the cabin, Clara moved slower than usual, stirring oats on the stove with one hand while the other traced lazy circles across the worn wood counter. She hadn't spoken since the sign. Not about it, not about the Comanche riders, not even about sharing a bed for the first time. But Amos didn't push her. He'd learned long ago, words come when the silence has done its work. Outside, the storm washed away most of the footprints, but the damage lingered. The townsfolk might have been too afraid to string her up, but the warning was clear. They wanted her gone, and if not her, then him. By noon, Amos heard hoofbeats again. He didn't reach for the rifle this time. He just opened the cabin door and waited. It was Sheriff Henley, dripping and sour-faced, with a paper sealed in wax. "Morning, Carver," the sheriff said, dismounting. Amos didn't answer. Henley cleared his throat and held out the paper. Town council met. You weren't invited. Decision was made. Amos took the paper, read it once, twice, then folded it carefully and tucked it into his coat. Henley nodded like it hurt his neck. You've got till sundown. Pack what you need. Clara had stepped to the threshold behind Amos. Her hair was damp from where it clung to her collarbone. What happens if we don't? She asked. Henley shifted his boots on the wet earth. I'm not saying the men'll come with torches, but I'm not saying they won't either. Amos nodded. That it? The sheriff hesitated. For just a second, his eyes met Clara's, and something flickered. Guilt, shame, or maybe just tiredness. That's it. He turned and rode off into the rain. Amos shut the door behind him and leaned against it. The silence stretched again, heavy this time, filled with a decision neither wanted to speak aloud. She turned back to the stove. You really think they'll come? They're scared, he said. Scared men do stupid things. He crossed the room, poured coffee into 2 tin mugs, and set one beside her on the table. We don't run, she said, barely above a whisper. No, I've run enough. I know. Her eyes met his, slow and steady. Then we stay. Amos didn't nod. He didn't speak. He simply reached for the Winchester, opened the door again, and stepped out onto the porch. The clouds were parting. The sky, still bruised and gray, was starting to bleed gold near the horizon. That's when he saw the first figures on the road. 6 men, 2 carrying shotguns, one with a noose hanging from his belt like he thought it made him brave. They weren't hiding their intent. Amos didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He just walked to the center of the clearing and stood like a monument. Behind him, Clara stepped out too, wearing the shawl she'd mended with her own hands, hair tied back, shoulders square. The men stopped about 20 yards out. You had your warning, the one with the noose said. Amos didn't move. And I gave you mine. The men looked unsure now. Maybe it was the way Amos stood. Maybe it was the look in Clara's eyes. Not fear, not anymore, just a stillness that made the wind seem louder. Then a sound rose behind the trees. Another set of hoofbeats. Dozens. The men turned. Out of the tree line came horses. Riders. Comanche. At least 20 of them, moving slow, deliberate. At their head was Toka. Face painted again, but this time with marks of protection, not mourning. He didn't raise a spear. He didn't reach for a weapon. He just rode forward and stopped beside Amos. She sent word, Toka said. We came not for war, but for witness. The men with the shotguns shifted. One even stepped back. Toka looked past them toward the town. You mark this girl again, we mark you. One of the townsmen spat on the ground. You got no right here. Toka just smiled. Then why are your hands shaking? The man with the noose stepped forward, puffing his chest. This is white land. White laws. Amos spoke then, slow, deep. This land wasn't yours to begin with. You just took it. And now you're mad. 'Cause someone didn't let you take everything. The men faltered. Toka raised a hand. We go. But she stays. And you leave them alone. Or next time we bring more than horses. With that, the riders turned, melted into the trees again like smoke. The mob scattered. Some walked backward. Some rode off. No words. Just the quiet shame of cowards when seen for what they are. When the last of them vanished down the trail, Clara exhaled. Her fingers clutched Amos's arm. Why did they come? She asked. Amos looked toward the trees. Because you're not just mine, he said. You're theirs too. And you belong to nobody. They stood there in silence as the sun broke fully over the trees. And for the first time in a long time, the earth felt still. That fall, the leaves burned gold along the ridges. Amos chopped wood every morning before sunrise, and Clara laid kindling like she'd always known how, with quiet hands and eyes that finally lifted when she looked folks in the face. No one came after them again. The town didn't forget, but it did something harder. It went quiet. That kind of silence wasn't surrender, but it wasn't war either. The men who once swore she was cursed began looking away when they passed Amos on the trail. The women who clutched their children tighter now only watched her from behind curtains, unsure what it meant when a girl like Clara still stood upright, shoulders square. Some mornings, Clara rode into town on her own. She'd trade soap or herbs for flour and return with a paper-wrapped bundle of sugar under her arm. Once, she walked past Sheriff Henley on the porch of the post office. He tipped his hat and said nothing. She nodded back, nothing more. In December, snow fell heavy. Amos taught her to trap rabbit along the ridge. She taught him how to wrap wounds using willow bark and pine resin, a medicine her mother once made before the raids and camps and rail lines took everything but memory. At night, they didn't talk much. He'd sit at the table carving notches into a scrap of cedar. One for each day they weren't run out, one for each time she smiled without fear. She'd watch the fire, sometimes whispering in Comanche under her breath like it was a prayer, other times singing so soft even the wind couldn't catch the tune. Then spring came, and with it, the baby. She told him without fanfare. Just set a cup of coffee in front of him one morning, sat down across the table, and placed her hand flat over her belly. His eyes lifted slowly. She didn't speak. Didn't need to. He looked at her hand, then reached across the table and laid his own over hers. Gently, with reverence. "You sure?" he asked. She nodded. "Yours?" She blinked once, then twice. "Yes." He let out a breath that sounded like a man laying down a weight he'd been carrying too long.